This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth, buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
David Monroe was the kind of man people counted on. At 50 years old, he had built a steady business in Texas, one that didn't just keep him afloat but gave neighbors paychecks, families meals, and struggling friends a safety net. Generosity wasn't something he performed, it was simply who he was. Yet behind that reputation was a man learning how to live with emptiness. After his divorce, the house that once rang with voices now sat in heavy silence. To fill it, David played his old Willie Nelson records, the worn crackle of vinyl giving him company. Some nights he laughed at memories carried in those songs. Other nights, the silence pressed too close, reminding him of what was gone. Still, to the world outside, David carried light. Friends recall him at a summer barbecue, sleeves rolled, grease from smoked brisket on his hands, head thrown back in laughter so deep it shook the table. In that moment, he looked untouchable, alive, warm, steady. But life does not always honor the character of the man who lives it. That same David, who laughed loudest and gave most freely, would soon be remembered for something unthinkable. The man who once filled a room with warmth would be discovered in a place colder than anyone could have imagined. The question lingers like a shadow over every memory that survives him: how did David Monroe, a man defined by generosity, become the center of one of the darkest crimes Texas has ever seen? David Monroe lived by a clock that served everyone but himself. He opened his small Texas office before sunrise, set out coffee, checked schedules twice, and made sure the newest hire never felt like the newest hire. Payroll hit on time. Vendors got paid early. If someone fell behind, David found a quiet way to cover the gap. People called it generosity, he called it responsibility. Home revealed the man behind the role. The counters stayed clear. The sink never held more than one glass. On the shelf, a row of worn history paperbacks leaned against a ceramic Longhorn he'd picked up years ago on a road trip. Evenings settled the same way most nights, a record turning, a single cube of ice melting in small batch bourbon, the soft thrum of traffic beyond the window. Friends pictured him there, head tilted, listening, and believed he was at peace. But peace wasn't the whole truth. David carried a quiet stubbornness, the kind that made him wave off concern with a smile. He worked when tired, missed a doctor's checkup he promised to keep, and let unread texts sit too long because he didn't want to burden anyone with the weight of his loneliness. Divorce had emptied the house of its familiar noise, he tried to refill it with rituals that kept the silence in its place. On weekends, he forced himself outside, church breakfasts, neighborhood barbecues, birthday toasts delivered with the old warmth that made people lean in. Then he went home to a room that did not lean back. He wanted more than noise. He wanted company that didn't require pretending. Late at night, that want guided him past cautious lines he'd once drawn for himself. He clicked through profiles on a site built for appetites and secrecy, a place where boundaries blurred and promises sounded like rescue. One profile stood out, confident, authoritative, familiar in a way that suggested safety. David believed he was moving toward connection. He never saw how carefully he was being guided, not toward comfort, but toward control. The last day began with lists. At 7:11 a.m., David emailed a supplier about a backordered part. At 8:03, he texted an employee a quick joke about the heat, then paid an invoice from his phone at 8:27. A bank record shows a small purchase just after 9, coffee, 2 bottled waters. He signed for a delivery at the office shortly before noon and called a friend at 12:42 to confirm a barbecue next weekend. Routine, steady, ordinary. By evening, the pattern shifted. At 6:18 p.m., David logged into the site where he'd been trading careful messages with a man who said he was a former cop. The chat recovered later shows nervous energy in David's phrasing, polite, earnest, asking about boundaries, confirming time and place. The other man replied with confidence and brevity, directing details, setting rules that sounded reassuring if you wanted to be reassured. At 8:57, a security camera caught David locking his front door. He wore pressed jeans, a dark shirt, and carried his phone in his left hand, keys in his right. He did not take the jacket hanging on the hook by the door, the one he grabbed on almost every late-night drive. His taillights slid down the street, turned, and disappeared. Traffic cameras stitched together a map, eastbound, then south, then a quieter road where lots empty out early and storefronts sit dark with their metal grates pulled down. A camera outside a storage facility captured his car at 9:41, idling, then rolling forward. Minutes later, a second lens registered another vehicle pulling in. The angle was poor, the plate unreadable. The timestamp matters. Witness fragments fill the gaps. A dog walker heard a car door slam, too hard. A resident in an upstairs unit noticed 2 men standing close, one gesturing, the other nodding as if to keep the peace. Somewhere nearby, the thin plastic rattle of something wheeled over uneven pavement clattered, then stopped. The details don't shout. They accumulate. By morning, concern replaced routine. David missed a call with his foreman. He didn't respond to a friend's text about game tickets. At 10:06 a.m., calls began rolling to voicemail. An employee drove past his house at lunch and saw no car. By late afternoon, police were notified. Officers found his vehicle first, parked and locked near a strip of shuttered storefronts. Inside, the receipt from the prior night, one of the bottled waters half finished, and a clean interior that looked almost staged by its very order. Latent prints on the passenger side did not belong to David. The first pass through his home felt like walking into a photograph. The mail was stacked squarely. The glass on the side table held a thin ring of melted ice. The record player's arm rested where he always placed it, not dropped mid-song. Nothing broken. Nothing scattered. But the jacket by the door, the one he never left without at night, still hung untouched. The absence had a shape to it. Detectives mapped his phone's last pings and found a pocket of signal silence that began shortly after the storage facility timestamp. They pulled footage from nearby lots, tracked a cluster of dumpsters behind a grocery, and noted something else. In the corridor where cameras overlapped, blind corners created pockets where things could be moved quickly, wheeled briefly, and never noticed again. The scene did not read like a man who chose to vanish. It read like a man redirected, from open spaces into tighter ones, from control into custody, from routine into someone else's design. This house wasn't whispering accident. It was screaming something else. At first, detectives tried to treat David Monroe's disappearance like any other missing person case. A locked car, an empty house, and a man with no history of vanishing, it could have been a robbery gone wrong. They checked pawnshops, logged serial numbers, and questioned anyone who might be moving stolen goods. But his wallet was still at home. His accounts hadn't been touched. Not a single thing of value was missing. The burglary theory collapsed under its own silence. Talk shifted to prowlers. Weeks earlier, neighbors had whispered about strange cars idling in the subdivision. One woman recalled a driver who kept circling, headlights off. Another insisted she'd seen someone walking the cul-de-sac just after midnight. Patrol logs confirmed complaints but no suspect ever materialized. The leads bled away, shadows without substance. Investigators then asked if it was an accident. Could David have wandered, collapsed from heat or a hidden medical problem? Search and rescue fanned across the fields. Floodlights swept through ditches. Cadaver dogs barked into the night as volunteers trudged through mud. The searches stretched hours, then days. Nothing. With each false path, frustration built. Detectives knew time wasn't just slipping, it was closing doors. Every wasted day meant evidence decayed, memories blurred, trails cooled. Yet nothing pointed outward. Not burglars. Not prowlers. Not chance. That left only one conclusion: David's disappearance wasn't random. It was directed. Someone had planned, had lured, had stripped away every ordinary explanation. And for the first time, suspicion turned inward, to the man David believed was safe. Science would confirm it. The suitcase was found off a back road where weeds clawed through broken asphalt and cicadas droned in heavy air. Detectives unzipped it with gloved hands, already bracing for what lay inside. David Monroe's body, folded unnaturally, lay stripped of clothes, his final dignity sealed in fabric meant for luggage. It was a discovery that stopped even seasoned officers cold. The autopsy gave his silence detail. Bruises patterned his chest and arms, marks that spoke of restraint, not struggle. Ligature impressions cut across his wrists, faint but clear under forensic light. A fracture along the jaw suggested a blow, not fatal, but controlling. Inside his lungs, the absence of air told the truth. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Manner, homicide. Trace evidence tightened the noose. Fibers clung to his skin, identical to the lining of the suitcase. Microscopic hairs, recovered from seams, belonged to another man entirely. Fingerprints lifted from the hard shell matched the name investigators had already begun circling, the ex-cop who had drawn David in. Digital forensics filled in the pattern. Messages from the S&M site showed two voices, David's, open and hopeful, and the suspect's, clipped, authoritative, always steering. What looked like conversation was in truth choreography, one man rehearsing vulnerability, the other rehearsing control. The evidence was not just technical. It was personal. When investigators shared the findings with David's family, grief turned to rage. They wept at the thought of his last moments, restrained, suffocating, stripped to statistics in a coroner's report. Friends who once remembered him laughing at barbecues now pictured him trapped in a container, reduced to fibers and fragments of proof. The backroad suitcase had given detectives their first undeniable answer. David Monroe had been murdered. And the science that mapped bruises, ligatures, and fingerprints all pointed one way, toward a man who wore a badge as bait and left his victims discarded like objects. The case had shifted. Doubt was gone. Evidence was king. And the weight of that evidence was about to be carried into the interrogation room, where a mask of confidence would finally begin to crack. The suspect walked into the interview room as if he owned it. A former cop, 42, he carried himself with the assurance of a man who thought he knew every trick behind the glass. He sat straight, placed his phone face down, and answered the first questions with crisp confidence. At first, his story held. He claimed he never met David Monroe, never left home that night, never strayed from his television. He spoke quickly, rehearsed, as if speed could pass for honesty. Detectives circled slowly. They started with the timeline, phone use, routes, routine. He filled in blanks too neatly. Then they slid a still across the table, his car, caught on traffic cameras near the storage facility where David's phone went dark. He frowned, leaned forward, said the system must have misread. Another car, same make, same model. He repeated it, as though repetition might make it true. The investigators let silence do its work. Silence stretches. People rush to fill it. He added details no one asked for, explanations that bent under their own weight. When shown screenshots from the S&M site, his handle, his phrasing, his rules about meeting spots, he shifted again. Anyone could make a fake profile, he insisted. Then came the fingerprints on the suitcase shell. His mask flickered. He asked for water. Hours passed. He denied, then deflected, then softened. Yes, he had spoken to David online, but only briefly. Yes, they'd considered meeting, but he cancelled. Detectives pressed with the recovered chat logs that fixed the meeting time. His voice lowered, his answers shrank. He asked if he was under arrest. Not yet, came the reply. Beyond the station walls, the story exploded. News banners screamed suitcase murder. His name carried weight, not for respect, but for the complaints in his record: force used too quickly, misconduct brushed aside, a badge leveraged as power. The community fractured. Some cried frame up. Others saw what they had long suspected, a predator cloaked in authority. The interrogation ended, but the evidence did not. Prosecutors began shaping their case, building exhibit on exhibit: fingerprints, fibers, camera footage, autopsy results. The defense sharpened its blade on the only edge available: doubt. The trial would decide whose story survived the collision. The courtroom air was heavy, thick with a silence that felt rehearsed. The jury filed in, 12 ordinary citizens now holding extraordinary weight. At the front row, David Monroe's family sat rigid, a framed photograph resting near folded tissues. Across the aisle, the defendant kept his gaze fixed forward, jaw set, hands clasped as if locked shut. The prosecution opened cleanly: a man who craved connection, a suspect who exploited that craving, a meeting that became a murder. Then they began their staircase of proof. The digital analyst spoke first. He traced logins, IP addresses, and server recoveries. Every path led back to the suspect's router, the suspect's device, the suspect's words. On the screen, chat messages appeared: David's cautious, open lines against the suspect's clipped commands. Jurors leaned forward, pens scratching with each timestamp. Next came the traffic camera technician. He pieced together the night frame by frame: the victim's car turning south, the defendant's car arriving minutes later at the same lot. The footage was grainy, but undeniable in sequence. Then the medical examiner took the stand. No theatrics, no pauses for drama. Just anatomy. Bruises patterned by restraint. A jawline fractured by force. Petechiae in the eyes, the silent markers of asphyxiation. He explained cause and manner with steady precision. When he described the suitcase as the vessel of concealment, not accident, the gallery stilled. A trace analyst followed, describing how fibers cling, how hairs embed in seams, how fingerprints press into textured plastic. Every sample pointed back to one person. Each fragment on its own small. Together, they formed a net. Finally, friends and coworkers testified. One read David's last playful text. Another described the panic when calls went unanswered. A neighbor recalled the slammed car door and the faint rattle of wheels on rough pavement. Science and memory, fused into a single story. When the defense rose, they tried to pry the net apart. Could the logs be spoofed? Could cameras mistake one vehicle for another? Could the suitcase have passed through unseen hands? They pressed on chain of custody, contamination, the suggestion of a second man outside the camera's reach. Doubt, not certainty, was their currency. But the state's response was measured. Not one piece of evidence stood alone, they said. The proof was in accumulation: digital, physical, human, each layer reinforcing the others. In the end, the body itself told the truth. David Monroe did not climb into a suitcase. He was put there. The defendant never testified. He sat silent, shoulders rigid, flexing one hand against the table's edge each time the suitcase was mentioned. Jurors noticed. Closing arguments distilled months into minutes. The prosecution pointed to pattern and predation. The defense urged the jurors to imagine shadows as reasonable doubt. The judge delivered instructions, reducing the ocean of testimony into legal elements that must be met. The jury left the room. In the gallery, David's family leaned into one another, their eyes fixed on the photograph. At counsel table, the defendant traced the margin of his pad, a small groove deepening with each pass. Hours dragged. Then the bailiff opened the door. The jury had reached its decision. When the jury returned, the room shifted. Chairs scraped faintly as 12 strangers carried the weight of months into a single envelope. The foreman's voice shook once, then steadied, guilty of murder in the first degree. The words detonated quietly, changing everything. David Monroe's family crumpled into one another, tears spilling against clasped hands. Their sobs were not loud, but they cut sharper than the gavel that followed. The photograph of David on the front bench seemed to stare back, a man mid-laugh, frozen at a table he would never return to. Across the aisle, the defendant's stillness cracked. His jaw clenched, yes, but what betrayed him was smaller, the twitch of fingers against the table's edge, restless, cornered. For the first time, the man who once carried a badge looked stripped of it, hollow in a place where authority could not shield him. The judge's sentence came swift, life without parole. No escape, no release. He would live behind steel for the rest of his days. But even as justice was declared, the courtroom knew justice could never equal restoration. David Monroe had been a man of routine, of small kindnesses, of record spinning while bourbon melted into amber light. That was the image his family carried, not the suitcase, not the autopsy, but David in his chair by the window, half smiling at music only he could hear. In the end, it was that David who had spoken through evidence, through witnesses, through science. His voice, stolen in life, returned in verdict. And the truth, once hidden, could never be packed away again. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries that expose the hidden patterns of manipulation and violence. Hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Because in our next case, we'll uncover another story where trust turned deadly, and the warning signs were ignored until it was far too late.